Guten Abend und herzlich willkommen zu dieser Lesung am Lyrikkabinett mit dem Titel Hopelessness, alternative britische Lyrik. Mein Name ist Jeschke, ich bin wissenschaftliche Assistentin am Lyrikkabinett und werde den heutigen Abend moderieren. Kurz zur Sprache heute Abend. Wir werden hauptsächlich auf Englisch sprechen. Ich werde mich allerdings immer wieder bemühen, kurze Zusammenfassungen auch im Deutschen zu geben, sowie Ausschnitte von Verity Spotts Lyrik auf Deutsch lesen, sofern sie in Übersetzung vorliegen. Zunächst aber einige einführende Worte auf Deutsch. Zum Anlass dieses Abends: Es handelt sich um eine Kooperation zwischen dem Lyrikkabinett und dem Department für Anglistik und Amerikanistik der LMU, genauer dem Lehrstuhl von Tobias Döring. Diese Kooperation hat sich daraus ergeben, dass das Lyrikkabinett seit einigen Jahren verstärkt auch Chapbooks aus dem angloamerikanischen Bereich sammelt. Chapbooks sind im Grunde kleine subkulturelle Veröffentlichungen, die manchmal wie punkig und billig gemachte, getackerte Hefte aussehen, manchmal aber auch sehr feine kleine Büchlein sein können, die zum Beispiel handgenäht mit Fadenheftungen sind, die sich aber insgesamt meistens in einem nicht kommerziellen, literarischen oder künstlerischen Bereich bewegen. Zur Vermittlung dieser Chapbooks habe ich im letzten Semester an der LMU ein Seminar geleitet, zusammen mit Studierenden eben am Thema Chapbook gearbeitet. Dieses Seminar trug den Titel Alternative British Poetries. Und wir haben uns einerseits eben die Chapbook-Untergrundszene angeschaut, andererseits aber auch Insta-Poetry und Spoken Word, also im Grunde verschiedene Szenen, die die Form des Buches nicht als die primäre literarische Form sehen, sondern das Lyrikschreiben erst einmal als eine Art Alltagspraxis sehen, die zum Beispiel in Kleinstauflagen veröffentlicht werden kann oder einfach spontan im Internet geteilt werden kann. Heute Abend ist eine Art öffentlicher Abschluss sozusagen dieses Seminars, aber über das Seminar hinausgehend, um noch einmal mit einer Lyrikerin aus Großbritannien zusammen diese Themen zu durchsprechen, warum in verschiedenen Publikationsformen schreiben, die erstmal nicht die Buchform sind. Verity Spott, unser Gast, Dichterin aus Brighton, bewegt sich gewissermaßen in allen drei genannten Bereichen, also Spoken Word, Social Media und Chapbooks. Denn Verity organisiert die monatliche Lyrik-, Musik- und Performance-Reihe Horseplay in Brighton und ist auch als eindrucksvolle Performerin ihrer Lyrik bekannt. Verity publiziert regelmäßig Gedichtentwürfe spontan auf Social Media bzw. auf einem Blog. Zuletzt auch die sehr eindrucksvollen visuellen Formate, die in der Veranstaltungsankündigung des Lyrikkabinetts gezeigt wurden. Vielleicht haben das manche von Ihnen oder euch auch gesehen. Und vor allem publiziert Verity sehr viel in Chapbook-Formaten. Zu ihren Publikationen gehören Gideon von 2014, Trans Manifestos von 2016, Click Away Closed Door Say von 2017 und das 2020 erschienene Hopelessness, das auch das titelgebende Buch für diese Veranstaltung war. 2018-19 war Verity Spott Poet in Residence at the University of Surrey. I will now switch primarily to English to introduce Verity briefly in English as well. Verity Spott, born in 1987, is a poet and performer from Brighton, whose publications include Gideon, Trans Manifestos, Click Away Closed Door Say, and Hopelessness, which was the title-giving volume for this event. Verity organizes the monthly poetry performance and music event Horseplay in Brighton and was poet in residence at the University of Surrey in 2018 and 19. The best introduction to Verity's work, however, is probably Verity's work itself, and we'll now move immediately into what will be two reading blocks tonight with a conversation between the two of us in the middle. Both reading blocks will begin with a bilingual reading in which Verity will read part of a prose block poem in English, and I'll read a German translation by Charlotte Thiessen, which was published in Artichoke 11. After this, Verity will read from her book Hopelessness in the first reading block. Yeah, welcome Verity Spott, over to you for the first reading.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I don't speak German, so I can't speak to you in German. And I'm sorry that I can't be there as well. I would have really liked to visit Lyrik Cabinet and met with you all, but yeah, here we are. So in your silent, still, small throat, my broken voice may sing. I'd say a mile off the shore is the wind farm, 168 windmills. I wonder what their sound will be. As they were being hammered into the seabed, the pile drivers sent their echoes to the surface of the water. I stood there by the pebbles at the edge of the water on a very cold and still night. The sound was barely audible, yet so completely full. It seemed that the sound was coming up from the smooth, flat surface of the water, that the smooth, flat water was somehow projecting the sound into the still night air. I fell forward in my bed with a gasp and my eyes shot open. By the edge of the tidal flow, I watched. We watched as the water found its passages towards the sea. We watched it come back. We were stranded, and we were also drowning, and we were also breathing, and we were also silent. We were also speaking. We were speaking as the water was projecting itself into sound, into the air, into space, into our minds. We were also no longer alive, and we were also completely full of life. In fact, you and I, we told ourselves, were the life and soul of the party. And so we stepped from room to room. Our vast economies, our limitless data, conversations, stepping back and forth against the tide, a colossal warning on the beach. People must not come onto the beach or the sea whilst they are alive. Unless sanctioned, they must first be dead people. We do not speak ill of the dead or of newborns. It is everyone in the middle we detest. The young know nothing. The middle-aged are themselves. The old are stupid and angry. The dead are perfect. We do not speak ill of a tide once receded. The stones and jetsam it leaves behind it. They are its clothes, the discarded. Speaking like a dotard, fire and fury. The sound that rose from the water was so terrifying. You told me that it was the pile driver. Similarly, when the tide had totally receded, the wreck of the SS Wiener comes into view. Its mast pokes through the waves at high tide. It was left at the outflow, primed to explode. You told me.
Jetzt der gleiche Absatz in Übersetzung von Charlotte Thiessen. Dass in deiner stillen, noch kleinen Kehle meine gebrochene Stimme singen möge. Der Windpark befindet sich 1 Meile vor der Küste, schätze ich. 168 Windräder. Ich stelle mir vor, wie sie klingen mögen. Als sie in den Meeresboden gehämmert wurden, schickten die Schlagrammen ihr Echo der Wasseroberfläche entgegen. Ich stand da bei den Kieselsteinen am Wasserrand in einer sehr kalten und stillen Nacht. Der Laut war noch kaum zu hören und doch gänzlich satt. Es schien, als käme der Laut von der glatten, ebenen Wasseroberfläche, als würfe das glatte, ebene Wasser irgendwie den Laut in die stille Nachtluft aus. Mit einem Atemruck fiel ich von meinem Bett nach vorn, meine Augen weit aufgerissen. Vom Rand der Flut sah ich zu. Wir sahen zu, wie das Wasser sich seine Wege zum Meer bahnte. Wir sahen es zurückkommen, waren gestrandet und ertranken, und auch atmeten wir und auch schwiegen wir. Auch redeten wir. Wir redeten, während das Wasser sich in den Laut warf, in die Luft, in den Raum, in unsere Gedanken. Wir waren auch nicht mehr am Leben und wir waren auch ganz voller Leben. Tatsächlich waren du und ich es, so sagten wir uns, die der Party Leben einflößten. Also stiegen wir von Raum zu Raum, unsere gewaltige Wirtschaft, unsere unbegrenzten Daten, Gespräche, hin und her gegen die Strömung tretend. Eine kolossale Warnung am Strand. Menschen dürfen den Strand nicht lebendig vom Meer aus betreten, wenn ohne Genehmigung, dann müssen sie erst tote Menschen sein. Wir sprechen nicht schlecht über Tote, auch nicht über Neugeborene. Es sind alle dazwischen, die wir verabscheuen. Die Jugend weiß nichts. Die im mittleren Alter sind sie selbst. Die Alten sind dumm und cholerisch. Die Toten sind vollkommen. Wir tadeln keine Flut, hat sie sich zurückgezogen. Die Steine und das Strandgut, die sie hinterlassen. Das ist ihre Kleidung, das Verworfene. Sprechen wie ein dementer Greis, Feuer und Zorn. Der Laut, der aus dem Wasser stieg, war so fürchterlich. Du meintest, es sei die Schlagrammel. Gleichermaßen kommt das Wrack der SS Wiener in Sicht, wenn die Flut zurückgewichen ist. Ihr Mast ragt während der Flut aus den Wellen. Sie wurde im Abfluss hinterlassen, sagtest du, zum Explodieren scharf gemacht.
Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to read some, we'll finish that text in the second reading, but I'm now going to read something from this book, Hopelessness. It's quite hard to choose a short section of this book because it's quite a long text and it all flows together. So hopefully this will be something of a sample that will make some sense on its own. We lay down to die in the strangled grass. You looked at me, I looked at you. The sea was turbid and still. Echoes of lives moved through the buildings. I sat at a desk. You were helping me up, but I had to be helping myself. A cricket popped in her cage. I said, from my chair. I thought I could communicate from here with my mouth. I could shout, or I could use a phone or a pen. I could sign. Silence hung in the wake of the world. Private words I wasn't allowed. I said, from my cellar, I could speak from an apple, and felt myself move a little up into the quiet field, an empty space, a car park all tamped down in concrete. Where have you gone? Life has been so something since you left. A scorn to still say, life. The walls shift a little and wobble into line. And 8 miles away, a clutch of people shouting. Every flattened week, the flotsam of the movements, a process is botched. I am holding the cans, and the tube has come loose from the tape at the incision. Spite is the sound. There is no place, and I have the past lying in a trough. You sang, my heart is not convinced. My eyes were snapped awake, a freezing bellow of wind, the long march through the car park to the cluster in yellow, echoing ghosts of a meadow, in a car park, in a hall, in a county, in some counties, in a county, by a car park, in a strict and particular Baptist church, by a car park, inside a strict and particular Baptist church, dying to return my own Galilee to the floating mouth of the shore, who accelerates yet still remains austere. I could motion in a box, in a field, on a sofa, in a chain, in a nozzle, in a bed, from a leaf to a stone, from a bolt to a gluey hand, in cuts, or to a blue-green light where, just above the car park, in the sky that turns the tarmac into grasses, mourning you in LEDs, lamps drop like wildflowers on the sea to kill the day, making your best choices, sensible, maggoty, diluted, and in 4 new locations, Grace Church, Vineyard, something I will never forget, suspended in space or air. I am lit and gleaming in the flowers and soft dead body in the long warm grass, switch and smile up the blank body, blank him off, papillon, LEDs reforming into foam. The tide turns back, the hardest still. I come here to stare in the icy brine. I could communicate from here, and here. I used my fingers in my head, tube, clumsily pushing it back in the wound, tearing at the bandages which gave their hours to bleed me, who only want to do it now, sluice back through hard retention. Pain and little plastic gloves take you through the engram by any quiet mechanism. The bed sheet was red, the carpet was grey, the lamp was unique, the pain was the bed sheet was red, the window was clear, the meadow was there, the eye has quit. By any quiet mechanism. Sorry, what? We're going to try and attach the tube now. The tube, okay? Lying in the lonely bed, blinking and sighing, moving gently onto a side, then another. There will be no sleeping. There are thoughts. There is the blunt light and smells. This room is a mistake, they think. They lie in their bed. You are sent back to bed, back to the wide world, narrow down the tube in a lit up park or a field. He presses you dead and open, flat out. What are you? Knowing transcript in motor by dead acute or royal, in a cleft, something I will never, that memory held or arrested in clots, coined and pushed to the pressure of testimony, will not forgive, will not let up. My Chang flowers tell me. Across the new gaping meadow, you are going on a madness. A phoenix stumbles in the war. Her hands and feet scramble like coffins. You are disruptive, decaying, amounting to a hidden excess. Scrub the road. There is grass beneath grass, soil beneath soil, nozzle, tube, wire, rubber, pulverized categories, pulped into meanings, pushed into tubes, pushed into their wound, cleaned and sent back. You tell the meadow, I did the things that girls did. That something I can or will never forget, arrested in space, constantly warring to recount, stumbling into the wide open field. There is a ping pong table in a corner, a gulping crack like a voice sunk down in the middle of your dozing mind, a quiche. The men wear no ties, two of the women wear headscarves. A man is speaking to the small assembly. His name is Richard Bennett. The talk entitled Catholic Mysticism and the Emerging Church. I've been listening to the talk. It is dry and the children are forced to sit in it. I've gone to leave the hall and walk out to find myself in a larger hall of the same dimensions, the same contents, even Richard Bennett giving a talk entitled Catholic Mysticism and the Emerging Church Revisited. When a tiny hall in the corner, a strict and particular madness in the home counties, tiny in the larger hall, a strict and particular Baptist church in the home counties, housing a strict and particular Baptist church in the home counties. Outside of here are the home counties, in here, the church, and inside the church, both in the home counties. Gently, now, very slowly, hollow yourself out. Things that could have been yours, a tangible derelict stance, unbreakable oath on the feelings of officers, the distant tattoo, and why this corrupt image? Too much to easily promise, surely. And as the district softly agrees to itself, the meadow becomes a station in prayer, an oath to the silos, abandoned slag heaps, unlisting feelings, protecting the hobbies of the meadow. You can't just start to work and expect everyone else to follow you, to turn to them and snarl at having started without stability. You can't just expect love. You have to earn it, snarling back at the indolent, precarious day-by-night workers, pretending not to be tired or in grief, but for the £3.70 an hour you're promised. And in fact, you can't be in love, not at the moment. Anything you amount to must contain a strategy, like getting out of being forever beholden to loss. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for this great reading from Hopelessness. My immediate question picks up on that title right away. It's also a title we gave to today's reading, so Hopelessness, Alternative britische Lyrik. My first question is, why hopelessness? Why this as a title, or why this as a feeling?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer, in that I don't have an orthodox memory of why I decided that that was going to be the title. But I spent about 3 years writing this. It's quite a long book, and at some point that became a kind of working title. I think that perhaps maybe I'm kind of ascribing this title later, but I think that perhaps I felt excuse me, sorry.
No problem.
I think I felt that I'd come to very much distrust hope in lots of manifestations. I felt that hope was manifesting itself as a kind of enemy of life in a certain way, politically, I think. So, for example, in the kind of British left, after the Brexit vote and things, we had a socialist in charge of the main opposition party, the Labour Party, for the first time in my lifetime, really, you know. But and I felt there was a massive surge of hope, but to me, that hope just felt absolutely contaminated with failure already, and it felt that as though hopelessness was the kind of banned category, that we weren't allowed to be pessimistic. Suddenly there was something hopeful, and so if you express a kind of feeling of doubt, then that was perceived as kind of unorthodox betrayal or pessimism. And for me, it wasn't really a lack of hope in the politics itself, but just an absolute knowledge that it was going to fail, and wanting to have the conversation. What do we do when we lose this next election, which we did, and we had this kind of huge conservative landslide, and now we're left with, well, I'm sure, you know, anyone who could even spend a minute looking at the kind of political situation in the UK could see how kind of painful it might be. But also that's resting on the back of years and years of sort of painful attacks on the poorest people in this country and the most vulnerable people. And it was a feeling like that on a kind of larger scale as well. I don't know if people are familiar with the writing of Benjamin Noyes, but just before lockdown, I went to a lecture of his, and he introduced the slogan. You know, there's that famous slogan, "Don't mourn, organize," and he was saying, well, actually, no, don't organize, mourn. And the book is a book of mourning as well. But on a personal level, there's a lot of loss of close friends in the book, you know, people who died and things like that. And so it was maybe an attempt to actually mourn as well, rather than trying to fight. It was a kind of an attempt to go inside of the grief process a little bit as well, however messy that might be.
Yeah, so I'm just briefly going to try to summarize in German.
Yeah.
Verity hat, ich habe sie nach dem Titel Hopelessness gefragt, weil es ja auch ein ziemlich extremer und absoluter Titel ist. Verity hat es zum einen in Bezug gesetzt zur politischen Landschaft in Großbritannien, dass es fast irgendwie darum ging, sich quasi auch ein Recht auf Hoffnungslosigkeit einzufordern, insbesondere auch zu einer Zeit, als Jeremy Corbyn, ein linker Kandidat sozusagen zur Wahl als Prime Minister zur Wahl stand. Und das Gefühl war, dass sozusagen alle hoffnungsvoll sein müssten und man sich kaum erlauben konnte, irgendwie auch gleichzeitig noch komplexere Zweifel zu äußern oder auch mal deprimiert zu sein. Dazu gab es eben auch einen Slogan zu dieser Zeit, Don't mourn, organize, also trauer nicht, werde aktivistisch oder organisiere. Und es hat dann Benjamin Noyes umgedreht zu dem Slogan Don't organize, mourn, also werdet nicht aktiv, trauert. Und letztendlich ging es für Verity auch persönlich darum, bestimmte, ja auch Trauer zu Verlusten zu verarbeiten. Also es hatte sowohl einen persönlichen als auch politischen Aspekt. Yeah, maybe to pick up on that political aspect and the situation in the UK a little bit more. The title of the seminar I mentioned in the beginning to this reading was Alternative British Poetries. I partly chose the term alternative in an intentionally quite fuzzy and broad way to incorporate different sub-scenes such as what I might call the chapbook scene, Insta poetry and spoken word. So essentially any kind of scene that thinks of poetry mainly as a kind of practice initially, something integrated into everyday life, as opposed to something where you try to find an agent and then immediately get into the literary market, so to speak. You also, when we exchanged emails, you also spoke of radical poetries, which perhaps is a little bit less fuzzy or already gives this a specific edge. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what scenes or traditions you're alluding to, what you say when you say that, and what that means for your own poetry as well.
Yeah, wow, there's a lot to cover there. And I suppose that I think the ground is really shifting as well. So poetry books are selling better than they've ever sold in my lifetime. Poetry's a big thing at the moment. Suddenly, it's if you go to a kind of Waterstones, which is one of the big bookshops in UK. Poetry used to be kind of tucked away in a corner, and now it's still in a corner, but the corner's a bit bigger. And there are some quite famous poets. There are poets headlining festivals and things like that, music festivals. So I think there's a huge scene and lots of different scenes, like you say, going on. So I don't know much about Insta poetry, to be honest, but I know that there's a lot of it out there, and it comes from a kind of DIY ethos to some extent, which is kind of self-publishing, which is something that I've always been really interested in. As for spoken word poetry, that's enjoying a huge, a spoken word performance poet has just won the T.S. Eliot Prize, which is about the most prestigious poetry prize in the UK. As for scenes, I suppose where I found my own poetry, and I suppose where I can speak from, most of the poetry I'm involved in happens in small settings, like the basements or upstairs rooms of pubs, or even in people's houses, or small bookshops readings. And lots of the publishing happens on a really small scale too. So self-publishing is really common. People make magazines together, pamphlets, things like that. There's a long history of that going. I'd trace that back through the sort of underground poetry scenes in the UK in the 60s and 70s, for example. Lots of poets who are now quite well known were circulating work through kind of printing presses and things like this. So I'd say that a lot of it happens under the steam of the people who are writing the poetry and getting involved with it. And I think that engenders a certain degree of freedom. So you mentioned agents. I hardly know any poets who have agents, though I do know a few now. It is starting to happen. Whereas in the world of novel publishing, fiction publishing in the UK, if you want to look in with any kind of publisher, really, you need to have an agent, and you're already entering into a market space. So you're already your work is kind of being filtered through the possibility of it being sold and being marketable. Some of the most amazing poetry I've ever encountered has been published in tiny little runs of 100 folded pieces of paper, or kind of shitty looking pamphlets, or sometimes very carefully crafted as well. But a lot of the most exciting poetry that I know of can't really exist in that marketplace. And some that I could think of that might even be considered counter legal in terms of politics. So I'm excited by these spaces. I do think the ground is shifting a lot at the moment, though. A lot of the poets who I know who've been operating in quite underground ways, there are presses now. I mean, presses like the 87 Press, who published this, for example, who are getting a lot more traction. The books are appearing in bookshops and things like that, which is also exciting. But for me, there's a level of trepidation about this as well. There's a feeling of kind of anxiety that the poetry doesn't start falling into market regulation, I suppose. Yeah,
actually, that's something I found interesting too, because I know most of your work has been published in these little DIY small press publications. And then the 87 Press is a little bit perhaps at the margins of that, because on the one hand, they publish quite unknown, innovative poets. On the other hand, it is books, like real books, so to speak. And I was kind of wondering what your relation to that is, and if you also thought there was something exciting actually about publishing in the form of the book, for example, because it gives you a whole different possibility for length and for having some continuous writing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think I could have really published Hopelessness anywhere else, really. And their publisher, I've just finished this book, Mirror Matar, The Bow. And it's an amazing book-length piece of poetry. I really recommend people look this up. Actually, it's an incredible book.
Thanks.
Yeah, really incredible. But yeah, I think it's really exciting to have these book length, the possibility of book length works, and there are some really exciting books coming out of it. They've just published a book by Luke Roberts, for example, whose poetry I'm always encouraging people to read, but it's really hard to find any of it because it usually gets kind of handed out at poetry readings and tiny pamphlets and things, and they've just collected some of them together. So I am really excited by that possibility, yeah. And I think that perhaps it allows people to do slightly more ambitious projects. I also think that people are just thinking in that way anyway at the moment. It seems to me that there has been a kind of a shift in the kind of scope of people's writing projects. I feel like a lot more poets are writing kind of long works, really, and I'm not quite sure why that is. I think that the engendered possibility through publishing is one thing, but I also think that the kind of time we're living in, I would have said this already with the years of austerity in the UK and things, but now with this virus and things, I feel like time has at the same time been really compacted, but also really stretched out. And I feel that whereas in the early sort of 2010s, a lot of the poets I was interested in were responding very quickly, very directly to political situations, just like out in the streets. There were lots of protests, there were lots of riots. There was direct response to political crisis. Now I feel like everyone has been forced by this kind of grinding, slow death mechanism to slow right down and to actually start to pick through that stuff in intricate detail. So I think that perhaps that's part of it as well.
Interesting. I'll just very briefly summarize again in German. Ja, wir haben uns darüber unterhalten, dass Verity sich einerseits in der DIY-Chapbook-Szene verortet und ja diese Szene auch mit kleinen Lesungen, zum Beispiel in Kellern oder auch einfach ja bei Freunden, dass sie diese Lesungen sehr wichtig findet und auch lange Zeit viel in Chapbook-Formaten eben publiziert hat und sich in dieser Szene eigentlich orientiert. Gleichzeitig ist aber auch ein zunehmendes Interesse an der Form des Buches da, sowohl bei Verity selbst als auch insgesamt in der experimentellen britischen Szene. Und Verity meinte, dass es vielleicht auch mit der Pandemie zu tun hat, dass eben in den letzten 2 Jahren die Zeit sich auf eine seltsame Weise sowohl verschnellert als auch verlangsamt hat und dass die Menschen nicht mehr so sehr wie unter der Austerität in den frühen 2010ern in Großbritannien ganz schnell mit politischen Interventionen reagieren, sondern dass sich diese seltsame Lähmung auch ins Schreiben selbst übertragen hat und längere Formen exploriert werden sozusagen. Just maybe one additional question on this relation between different media and formats. So you said, for example, you don't have so much contact with Insta poetry. You do also publish poems sometimes just on social media, though, even if perhaps you wouldn't call it Insta poetry.
Yeah.
How maybe a question relating to that is, do you just write poetry and then you put it out into different channels, or do you yeah, how much is it affected by knowing where it might be published or read?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that nowadays we have loads of options. I've had a blog for a long time where I used to just put things up almost as I used to put them up so haphazardly. I used to post drafts and things and then realize after a while that I wasn't happy with that draft and have to take it down and repost it and things like that. I'm a lot slower with the blog these days, but I guess when I was first getting into poetry, there were blogs that I used to follow, like Sean Bonney's amazing abandoned building blog, and I really admired how Sean Bonney wanted to put his work out into the world almost as variously as possible. He wasn't precious about the work reaching people in different ways. He'd kind of read anywhere and he'd put his poems up online, and I thought this was a generous thing to do. Having said that, I really do value books as kind of specific objects, and I think they're important objects. I think that having a kind of almost having some kind of difficulty of getting hold of things is kind of helpful sometimes. It means that you have to kind of find things out and you know, find out where things outside of the kind of narratives of marketization might be happening. But yeah, in terms of social media and things, I mean, I think it's useful for people to get direct feedback sometimes. You know, if you're writing, it can be really helpful to it can almost encourage you to write, to have that direct feedback. And at the moment, I'm working with some more kind of visual work, and they're kind of impossible objects to print. I can't really put them into a book because it would have to be a huge full color book that no one's going to have the money to publish ever. So being able to put them up online is helpful. But yeah, I'm not really connected to, you know, a huge online scene really. I know lots of poets who use social media and things. I also have a huge distrust of social media, and I'm completely aware that it's a really unhealthy addiction, and that we should all not be doing it. But at the same time, I think there are, you know, just because there are really horrible people in charge of a mechanism, that doesn't mean that everything in the mechanism is bad. It just means that it's definitely being used for nefarious purposes.
Yeah, I think it's important that you point out that, so to speak, not all poets who write or publish on social media necessarily think of themselves as social media poets or Insta poets, because I feel like sometimes the way this is written about is just like a very specific trend, almost as if it was capitalized in one specific genre. But lots of poets use this in quite a casual way, actually, to get feedback, like you said. Yeah. So up to this point, we've mainly been talking about the materialities of your poetry in terms of different publication formats. Now to get also to the matter of poetry itself, so to speak, in terms of the actual language and formal aspects of your work. So there were two reasons I didn't feel so worried about you reading mainly in English tonight, to audiences who might partly be more comfortable with German. On the one hand, that your reading style is very performative in any case. And secondly, also that it can sometimes also be interesting to hear poetry without actually understanding the poem, whatever it might mean to understand a poem, because you might become aware almost of something like a sonic shape, or of other qualities like rhythm, repetition, atmosphere, that you hear by just hearing the words without understanding them fully, so to speak. Yeah, and my question relating to that more simply is just, what's your thinking about poetic form, and specifically, how do you relate your formal experimentalism and your political commitments in poetry in terms of the content, so to speak?
Wow. Yeah, there's a few things to address there. Before I answer that, I'll just go back to your point about the language difference. Just to say that I really agree that there's a huge value in listening to poetry in languages you don't understand. And last time I was in Germany, in Berlin, Monika Rink was read at the Artichoke event, and the reading was entirely in German. And I could have read the English translation at the same time, and I started to do that. And then I decided to stop and just listen to the poetry. And it's to this day one of my favorite poetry readings I've ever listened to. And giving up on the direct comprehension and listening to the music of the poetry, and the sound, the kind of sounds that it created, was really, really incredible. And so apologies. I mean, I know I read quite quickly, and sometimes I think if I'm reading to an audience who aren't speaking English as a first language, maybe I should read really slowly and carefully. But I think I'd rather get across that music that's in the kind of performative language and the performance of the text, because there's just as much meaning in that as there is in the kind of sense. I mean, a lot of my poetry doesn't make direct syntactical sense anyway, so we might be fighting for very little gain. You asked about sort of formal experimentalism. Yeah, so I always think about the term experimental because it does encapsulate lots of the stuff that I'm interested in and probably lots of the stuff that I'm doing. But when I write, I don't sit down and go, I'm going to do an experiment, which I think some writers do, right? Like a lot of conceptualist writers, they try to almost program the poem and then let the poem happen. And there's some really interesting work that's come out of that, and some work that I find a lot less interesting in the sense that you can tell me the concept and then I don't really need to read it almost. But then again, there's some poetry that's come out of those processes that is really interesting to read. But I don't think like that at all. I sometimes think maybe I think more like a lyric poet, and I do think about form a lot. I'm really obsessed with the sonnet form, for example, that people might be familiar with. But there are lots of different kind of formal structures of a sonnet, and one of the very basic ones is that it's song-like and it's kind of condensed. It's a compressed space, and I'm interested in that form because it's just changed over and over again throughout history, and lots of poets have done really interesting things with it. Contemporary poets like Bernadette Meyer and Ian Heames, and I guess more kind of lots of traditional poets like Shakespeare over in England has the most kind of famous sonnet form, his own sonnet form. But I think that I'm interested in what people do with these ideas that have been they have a history, but they continue to mutate, almost in the kind of evolutionary way. It's their fixity in their time and space. And I'm not sure what I think about political commitments and poetry. I mean, they seem completely intertwined to me, but they're always changing, and I have done this in the past. Actually, I've sat down and tried to write a poem about a political situation or something, and it's usually gone badly. For me, the two things need to be speaking to and with one another. They need to be in conversation, and that conversation is an ongoing examination of the self and the world, poetry itself, and the poetics. Again, it mutates and changes over time, and I think some of the most interesting political poetry that I've read isn't really kind of necessarily protest poetry or agitprop or anything like that. It's a continual conversation, right? Like, so the poetry is continuing to have a dialogue with the world around it and with the person or people composing it and the subjects that it covers, and it's a kind of mutual examination. It's not a one-way process. I'm probably interested the least, in fact, in poetry that is almost overly prescriptive in terms of politics and overly assured, right? Like poetry that's really sure of itself and that feels like it's answered its own question. I kind of feel like there has to be some kind of antagonism that keeps going, that keeps reproducing itself, and that kind of straining after that antagonism is where the poetry lives. Yeah,
so that's all really interesting. So one reason I was also asking this question was because I was thinking about your trans manifestos, which I think were also first published on your blog and then came out as a pamphlet with Shit Valley, a small press, in 2016. And I was thinking, so manifestos in general perhaps have in common that they often use extreme language, but they're not so often written in necessarily poetic language. Now, of course, what does that even mean? Perhaps I mean language that's not fully syntactically coherent, just as a starting point. And the trans manifestos, I think, were both an important intervention or a pamphlet that met with a good reception, so to speak, both in the poetry scene and also in the trans activist scene. And I was wondering just also if you thought of that as a kind of activist pamphlet or more as a complement to activism. Just what relation is there? Why a manifesto in poetic language?
Yeah, that's another good question, which I don't really quite know the answer to. When I started writing those what became those pieces, and later mutated into a much longer book called Prayers, Manifestos, Bravery, which has the trans manifestos as the first section, but there's two kind of following sections too. They started out as blog posts, just trying to understand and discuss certain things with people I knew, really. I didn't consider them poetry at all. I still don't know if they are poetry, if they are poems. I think some of them are poetic in moments, but I think if I was to put all of my poetry in one book, I don't know whether they'd be in there. They felt like kind of jokes about manifestos too. I mean, you say they had a warm reception. They also had some quite cold receptions. There were some people who were quite angry about certain things in them. And I think, that for me, there was a risk in writing them, right? Because there's the risk that it could look like I'm trying to speak for other people, which I was not trying to do at all. But there's a lot of uncertainty in those pieces of writing, because they were explorations that happened at the speed of thought, really. Most of them were written in one go very quickly, and I wasn't I guess I didn't know where they were going to end up when I started writing them. I guess this goes back to our last question, and for me, that's an important place to be. I watched this documentary about the sculptor Brian Catling the other day, and he said something about when he was working with clay, not knowing where he was going, what the end sculpture was going to be, and he described it as thinking with his hands. And I think I like to work like that quite a lot, actually, to think out loud or while typing or using a pen or painting or whatever, because I think that sometimes the world's full of kind of manifestos that are full of editing and certainty and things, and I kind of want to think about what an improvised manifesto would look like. What's the manifesto in this moment, right? And what does it say about the terror, that the pressure of the terror it's under, So I remember one of the early ones I wrote directly after a violent thing, like a physically violent thing happened to me, and I was in kind of panic. And so that then it's to say, what does the manifesto look like when what do you write when you are actually scared, when you're in shock or trauma? What do you write within that response, and what does that then say about the violence that came from outside? Right? So it's like the outside world turns in, and then the inside world turns it back out and kind of holds up a mirror or something. I think there were a lot more like that, and maybe it was a joke to use the word manifestos in a certain sense. And as the book went on, I couldn't use those same titles. So next section of the book is called "I Never Said That I Was Brave," which was a kind of joke about people telling you like you're really brave or you're really valid. It was a kind of joke about affirmation culture, which I think is a huge thing. And then there was a series of dispatches as well, and the whole thing kind of fizzles out through that process.
Ja, um kurz zusammenzufassen, wir haben jetzt über relativ viel gesprochen, vielleicht zusammenfassend. Ich habe Verity nach sozusagen der experimentellen Form ihres Schreibens gefragt und wie das was ja der Zusammenhang zu auch ihrem politischen Engagement im Schreiben ist. Sie hat erstmal gesagt, dass sie sich gar nicht weiß, ob sie sich unbedingt als experimentelle Dichterin sieht, sondern auch in gewisser Weise als Lyric Poet, also als lyrische Dichterin, zum Beispiel ein großes Interesse auch an der Form des Sonetts hat, und dass all diese Genres, also auch die Genres, die sozusagen sehr bekannt sind oder klassisch sind, über die Zeit ja auch mutieren, also man sich da immer wieder neu einschreiben kann sozusagen. Dann haben wir uns noch über eine Veröffentlichung von ihr mit dem Titel Trans Manifestos unterhalten und die Frage, inwiefern diese überhaupt ein Manifest sind oder wie sie an das Genre des Manifests anknüpfen. Und Verity hat gesagt, dass es zu einem gewissen Maße auch eine Art Witz ist, weil sich da sozusagen einzuschreiben in dieses politische Genre, und dass sie auch sehr stark improvisatorisch dabei vorgegangen ist. Maybe just one final question before we read again. I started by asking you about the word hopelessness, and I want to finish as well by asking you about another single word, which to me is always very striking in your poetry and reappears quite often, which is the word leaking. Yeah, I guess I just want to ask you why leaking, or what's the scope of association with leaking for you?
Yeah, it does appear a lot, doesn't it? And I'm still not too sure. It wasn't the first time it appeared, but it was the most intense time when I kind of realized that this was something I thought about a lot, which was when I was writing a book, Click Away, Close Door, Say. Right at the end, there's a poem called Elegy, and the whole poem is about somebody, the idea that a human being is leaking. That things are, so I guess leaking, it'd be interesting to have a dictionary definition, but I don't have a dictionary near me. But for me, the idea of leaking, it can come inward or outward, but it's the idea that something is accidentally passing through, right? So if you're in a boat and the boat has sprung a leak, it means that water is coming into the boat somewhere, and maybe you don't know where it is. It's a really terrifying feeling. It's filling. Or if you've got a bottle of liquid and it's the only thing you have to drink and it's sprung a leak, water's coming out of it, and again, maybe you don't know where it's going, where it's coming from, but a substance that is either internal or external is escaping or finding a new home, right? And I suppose in that book, Click Away, Close Door, Say, the feeling that someone was leaking was that there was, within this kind of care framework of social care, there were all these kind of professional barriers and walls that we have to put up, and many of them are there for a really good reason, right? Many of them, those are there to stop or safeguard against abuse, but also it comes to this position where your job is to care for human beings, but you can't appear human, and you almost can't treat them in a human way either, because of all these kind of professional barriers, and many of these barriers are there to prevent kind of people suing, or kind of people escaping as well, people, all sorts of things that aren't supposed to happen within the managerial marketing framework of social care. There were people in the care home I worked in that shouldn't have been living there, but because of the money that gets paid in, they were kind of being kept there. So the system is abusive itself, and within that framework, there's also the idea of leaking, which is kind of to do with intelligence. So leaking secrets, military secrets, political secrets. In the UK right now, we have a big situation where our Prime Minister is he seems to be leaking from every possible, every time he covers up a hole, another one bursts open. And it's interesting, I always think that this idea of leaking, it's kind of exposing a truth. If someone or something is leaking, then some of the substance from within that's kept hidden away is suddenly coming out into the light. But it's interesting to see in situations like this how when this happens, and it's happened for years and years in political situations, going back to the Panama Papers, for example, you know, the WikiLeaks, these big leaks, they tend to do very little, right? And maybe this draws us back to hopelessness in a certain sense, because sometimes you say, well, maybe if we saw everything, if everything was leaked, if everything was just laid bare, then everyone would change, everyone would realize what was going on, and everyone would change their minds, and we'd change everything. Actually, generally, the kind of wearing down, the drudgery of the kind of imposed hopelessness means that a lot of things can leak out into the cold light of day, but nothing happens. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll just move on to reading again. Yeah, like we said in the beginning, we'll start again with a bilingual reading from the translation in Artichoke.
Yeah. The fleet arrived at Invergordon on Friday, the 13th, and shore leave was given that night. There was some disturbance in the canteen, and several men addressed the other men present on the subject of the reductions in naval pay. On Monday the 14th, the Warspite and the Malaya proceeded to sea to carry out exercises. On Monday night, further meetings and disturbances took place in the canteen, and the men present agreed that the fleet should not be allowed to go to sea the next day. On Tuesday morning, in some ships, the men fell in when ordered and carried out the normal work of the day and prepared for sea. But in other ships, the men refused to fall in to be as a lost face, my tiny voice to sing, still small, but they'll a sail laughter slipped across the salt. We had some drinks, we danced, we kissed, that's all. Arrested on 9th of January 1954. In March of that year, Pitt Rivers was brought before the British courts, charged with conspiracy to incite certain male persons to commit serious offences with male persons, or buggery. It was the first time this charge had been used in a British court since the trials of Oscar Wilde in 1895, and it led to public criticism that the police were pursuing a McCarthy-like purge of society homosexuals. The father of participant Jeff Teft felt he needed to post a letter in a local newspaper disavowing his son. Piers Teft says that although he and his family are not racists, once his son's face and name were posted on social media, they became the targets of people upset with his son. The distance is non-metrical. The movements beneath your feet, the inclination of the voice to turn back, to give in, the speculation of credibility, the meanings in the bit and tail, the hazardous examples, the set in stone in stomach, the fact of victim, the fact of aggressor, the fact of the proximity of love, the traction of disrepair, the normality of sustain, the pang of forced closure, the pressure to be, the iconic nature of being alive, the games, e.g. golf, the analysis of the subject, the descriptions of illness, the testimonial, the cement of disdain, the barrel, the captain, the boatswain, the peninsula, being afraid, being tested, the elegance of the shrapnel, the hyper-intelligence of quantified freedoms, speaking, the endless glib section of the auditorium or of the galley, or of the lips smacking together in, or of the eyelids smacking back and forth, closing with a colossal loudness in the dark. The intrepid pioneer, for example, the Royal Air Force used it for target practice leading up to the invasion of Normandy. And in 1944, a gale carried the SS Wiener to a sandbar where the hull-covered boat took on water and stayed. The company's staying power, to give but one example. We gathered at the top of the field and walked. We were unquestioning of our complexion, the skin, for example, what it has given us. Speaking of that us, how uncomfortable you are now. What pain. The plaiting water snaking out through the marsh, and the birds that narrowly assess the ground for their landings. The twist of a kind in the stomach. The change in public opinion from pre-op to post-op, to the dead, to ingredients, at a fast incline, a living face. the violence always in inaction, the wreck loaded with explosives, things like that.
Am Freitag, den 13., erreichte die Flotte Invergordon. Jene Nacht wurde Landgang erteilt. Es gab einen Zwischenfall in der Kantine und mehrere Männer sprachen die Anwesenden auf die Minderungen des Flottenlohns an. Am Montag, den 14., fuhren die Warspite und die Malaya auf See, um Übungen auszuführen. Am Montagabend gab es weitere Treffen und Zwischenfälle in der Kantine und die anwesenden Männer entschieden, dass der Flotte am nächsten Tag der Seegang untersagt bleiben sollte. Am Dienstagmorgen traten in einigen Schiffen die Männer an, wie es ihnen befohlen wurde, und sie verrichteten die übliche Arbeit des Tages und bereiteten sich vor für die See, doch auf anderen Schiffen weigerten sich die Männer anzutreten. Tritt du auch an, sei ein verlorenes Gesicht, um meine winzige Stimme zu singen. Still, klein, dammt war's, Überfallenes Lachen rutschte über das Salz. Zitat, wir haben was getrunken, wir haben getanzt und uns geküsst, das war's auch schon. Zitat Ende. Am 9. Januar 1954 verhaftet, wurde Pitt Rivers im März desselben Jahres vor britischem Gericht angeklagt, Zitat, bestimmte männliche Personen angestiftet zu haben, schwerwiegende Vergehen mit anderen männlichen Personen zu begehen, beziehungsweise Sodomie. Zitat Ende. Es war das erste Mal seit dem Prozess von Oscar Wilde 1895, dass dieser Anklagegrund in einem britischen Gericht vorgebracht wurde. Es führte zu öffentlicher Kritik, die Polizei unternehme in gehobenen Kreisen eine McCarthy-artige Säuberung von Homosexuellen. Der Vater des Beteiligten Jeff Taft sah es als seine Pflicht an, einen Brief in einer Lokalzeitung zu veröffentlichen, in dem er seinen Sohn verleugnete. Seit Namen und Gesicht ihres Sohnes in den sozialen Medien verbreitet wurden, so Pierce Taft, würden er und seine Familie, obwohl sie keine Rassisten seien, Zielscheibe der Kritik von Menschen, die gegen ihren Sohn einen Groll hegten. Der Abstand ist nicht metrisch. Die Bewegungen unter deinen Füßen. Die Neigung der Stimme, zurückzukehren und nachzugeben. Die Mutmaßung über Glaubwürdigkeit. Der Sinngehalt im gebissenen Schwanz. Die gefährlichen Beispiele. Das in Stein, in Bauch gemeißelte. Die Tatsache des Opfers. Die Tatsache des Angreifers. Die Nähe von Liebe. Die Zugkraft des Verfalls. Die Normalität der Ausklingzeit. Der Schmerz, erzwungen Frieden zu finden. Der Druck zu sein, das Ikonische des Lebens, die Spiele, zum Beispiel Golf, die Analyse des Subjekts, die Krankheitsbeschreibungen, das Zeugnis, der Beton der Verachtung, das Fass, der Kapitän, das Boson, die Halbinsel, Angst haben, geprüft werden, die Eleganz der Schrotsplitter, die Hyperintelligenz quantifizierter Freiheiten, Sprechen, der endlose Schleimbereich des Saals oder der Kombüse oder der Lippen, die drinnen aufeinander klatschen. Oder der Augenlider, die vor und zurück klatschen, sich mit einer gigantischen Lautstärke im Dunkeln schließend. Zum Beispiel der unerschrockene Pionier. Die Royal Air Force benutzte sie als Ziel in militärischen Übungen im Vorfeld der Invasion der Normandie und 1944 wehte ein Starkwind die SS Wiener auf eine Sandbank, wo das durchlöcherte Schiff kenterte und liegen blieb. Das Durchhaltevermögen der Kompanie, um nur ein Beispiel zu nennen. Wir nannten uns oben auf dem Feld und gingen los. Unser Aussehen hinterfragten wir nicht. Die Hautfarbe zum Beispiel, was sie uns einbrachte, wo wir schon bei uns sind, wie unwohl dir jetzt ist, welch Schmerz. Die Wasserflechten schlängeln sich durch den Sumpf hinaus und die Vögel, die den Boden für ihre Landung eng einschätzen. Das Verrenken einer Art im Magen. Der Wandel der öffentlichen Meinung von vor zu nach der Operation zu den Toten in Stufen an einem raschen Anstieg ein lebendiges Gesicht. Die Gewalt immer in Tatenlosigkeit, das Wrack mit Sprengstoff beladen, so in etwa.
Thank you. Okay, the last thing I'm going to read is something really new. It's something very new for me. It's written in a very different way. I usually write at my computer, and I've been writing in this book, and it's very crowded, and it's kind of strange to look at. There are many, many pages of it, and I don't quite know which order everything goes in yet. I don't know even now which bits I'm going to read at which point. So this is an experiment, and it's something new, and it may be the only time I ever read it. We shall see. There's no title as yet. When it comes to life in the morning, when it comes in autumn warmly to life, where the tides are a tiny glint, it comes to life in feeling this in the morning of autumn, very early, with its itching skin on the arms. The beginning of each day swallows and often repeats itself, begins each morning. As the very tiny or giant tide does move, each day begins soft and drowning skin, which is not revenged for many months yet, continues to be clipped, and in the revert tongue of a quiet early morning starts to speak. One loose ear cut from my head for betrayal in the cold daylight. How will this hole in my head heal, and how was I tried? Stay, please stay. Bring over some light. I've been lost an ear. It was taken by law, taken in law. Law has done for my head a little hole. Hello? Hello? Any sound? Are you there? I'm a girl, of course. Take this, my sound, for it goes. For now, may I fall solid as day. There is dancing. I'm sitting here waiting for the air to clear or for my wounded ear hole to close. I heard a flood would come and I informed. I said, I can hear that a flood is coming. They took me into a little room white with blocks of green, and then one produced a tiny pair of scissors whilst four held me down. They slowly cut through the gristle and removed my ear. They asked me to thank them. I affected a blood-and curtsy as best one can when held to a plate. It would not be my end, they cheerily sang as they promised me to my napalm. I can tell by your eyes. Now I must leave you for a long year, a minute, or forever. What is it you want? For beauty brings their name beneath this healthy roof. What we have come to stare stands our noble flight. But we will not be going to war. That would only be stupid of us, like the children who go to war. We could go into some kind of war together. Our rules for the war will be these. There are many of us. Let there be only two. Let us both drink our water and cut out this arcane tongue. We shall heat up our blades, go back to our births, the little houses, how they sing. I like singing to you, my tired little war. She colours. So what is the problem that you make our dual war for? Fury, it ends and it ends. But rest, it is morning. It lights hard. Your heavy slips back to sleep. It is why I have had to keep a constant log of the tides, their movements and ours. Tell me that these are not the motions by moon, by war, by Wertho. Hide away in light. They decided well to end my heart, my birth, my walls, spoil, shit, unbarbed thoughts who merely stammer away, awash with principled mourning, my tribute to a long grey shore far, far beyond reach. Whistle. I will raise 100 shores for you. This is a ring, this a dynasty, many more lost time incidents. Get out. What is it that awakens shore? It is who does not begin to sing. Stay, stay late in pine that dreams colour knows beyond system repair. Shore project does not pile up. As received info becomes fraud, so it dips into radio, pretends to be a feeling, comes, expands, and gets shot and can't breathe and will simply never work. All beyond is binary, is still immersed in deflating you, my own true beyond the 40th floor of possible. Hand on teachers in shoreline, great Frank, the beach disaster, inscribes the beyond the use of caning. Then fear flares into a tongued yellow knot of clinging skies, permanent trap. A thing bites in its resume to the work week of a routine. It is on track to its own difference, its own self-defense, as though too many closed-end targeted life would not be lived to call alive again. Click, think, make grief suffer, you make sky prey indexes, ration in little Britain path, outer, out, end, everything, end, ever about you gone away. As I draw breath, but would not sing, still for you to say, clouds hinged in crimson leaned into the yawning ground. How hope would fade as you depart, a sudden turn. I ask you must not die. The time is far, the sirens are made. Your neck holds onto my arm. Ask for the habits of your body. Let them stutter their names, their temporary fragile routines. Might not I kiss, I bite, I breath at instinct and moves. How shrill and strangely, static you are. He is cruel. He has shut away my pigs. has locked and scorned my office, refused my games merry. Ah, he hates so uniformly. It is a repeated tongue jabs out into unfamiliar airs. My piggies bark and beg of his mercies. I know them. They are kind and deep, carry a million names, but he finds germs at the front of the shelf. And if he will never cease to fear, then my pigs remain locked, all at his mercies. Her head is wrapped in paper. Eager light of play, the face nebulous, ping open, snap inland of gentlest gantry. Fat green mist. Day falls, mute overhead. Do sorry, unending codes, play of fields, elect eyes, impressioned, have waste given to fear, a prism, by light known, fallen summer, devil heart pretend noise, made to prayer, stutters still, will not form lines in this quiet and heavy, hue of dawn, was made, was promised, was refused, was spent, was stilled, was silent, was hurt, its end, away goes. Of that who are you fell, was stupid, quiet now, dangled a scissor, eerie, snubbed, for motions there, none came. Oh, settle, please list them, the flaws, and only flaws. A list of only flaws. And if the flies do breathe, and if the legs theirs curl and burn spluttering fats of insect, but I am too unhollow, and I am also too breathed, goes into the basque, our chewing deaths, what their feelings are, renew, dissuade the heat death of the kitchen, this mouldy, it lived there, and the long quiet nights spread out in the name of morning. It is why the prison sits, the case for refining tongues. Her mortician, her faucet was knack, buckled the wheels, and so, as you say, it hurts, compels the monitors, checks the underwear drawer, the skinny toes too at the reframing world. I modelled the lace panties like the lungs of a minced up oyster. I engaged the park with barking, peeled my face down the legs, took the toe in the hands. I have a head, but the arm, the hand, the foot, the thumb, the back, far beyond possession. And there my speech on tabloid skins never fail in settlements. There is this thing of weakness. Who are the population? The course is rags to a sky. We are finically disproved. But hello, for I have a head. I extrude emblems. My terror potential is powerlessness, a gaudy apple. She sees to shed the wound rope. It is a list of 40 lives there, horrid with moth skins. Marcus builds his babies. They are physically hand grenade, one in his darling, and has humours, one his scourge. Marcus made a baby, its hand for the women. Marcus slams on the door, for he had a world to do. We saw he had failed at his chance, the thing you ought to do. I made 2 lists for struggle. Go out, the trees orange glow about the railing. We are going sad towards the bright new days, must eke to the beforehand of the rooms. It tastes the good, spends money, wails out the palm. There's a way for biting the facial patterning software. It acts on the heaps of stomach, a dark and greenish moth. I've carved my knees for biting, bite again, revise, immutable socket, winter distillation. How old? Hungry. As you became wrapped, the air dressed you, the clouds kissed your spine. Lay there, out in the garden, a pool of you, growing lifelessness.
Yeah, thank you very much, Verity Spott, for sharing your thoughts and your work with us tonight, and especially also for sharing this new work. Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you also to everyone for listening. Thank you to Lyrik Cabinet and to Professor Tobias Döring at LMU for making this joint event possible. And yeah, all good wishes to everyone, and to you, Verity. Stay safe and well, and hopefully we can welcome you to Munich one day.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Thanks for listening.